Janine Turner. I am founder and co-president of Constituting America. You know, this pandemic is tragic for so many people, incredibly frightening to all of Americans. It truly is a time of alone yet together. And one of the things that I guess you could say is a bright light of this dark time is the ability to host Zoom like this. We're not living in the dark ages when, you know, we couldn't communicate. So I want to introduce people on our panel. We have two of our extraordinary advisory board members. We have Tova Kaplan, who is our National Youth Advisory Director. She has, I don't know, we've known Tova for about 4 years now, and she's just simply a bright light extraordinaire, could rule the world someday. And she is, just get to know her. And we're thrilled that she's with us today. She's won our contest about 2 or 3 years in a row, and now she's the National Youth Director. So we're thrilled to have her with us. She's just bringing so much to the foundation. Tova, say hello.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Janine.
And then we have Dakare Chatman, who is also on our National Youth Board. And Dakare is our Constituting America ambassador, who's also a bright star. And we've known you for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years as well. Yes. And Dakare Chatman is immensely talented, just like Tova is a bright star. It should give everyone faith in Generation Z. So say hello, Dakare.
Hello. Thank you, everyone. And hello, Janine. You look wonderful.
Oh, thank you, Dakare. I know a lot of you are students today, and now here we have bright young students along with us today to kind of ask questions and make this not just an adult-themed panel, but to have students talking to students. Okay, last but not least, Andrew Langer, everybody. Woo!
Everybody.
Here is our scholar and our expert extraordinaire. Andrew, we've been friends for what, 10 years, I guess.
Yeah, it's been a bit. It doesn't seem like all that long, Janine, but you know, time flies when you're having fun.
It does. And Andrew has been, Mr. Langer, I should say, has contributed so, what's that?
Andrew's fine.
Oh, well, you know, I think I'll be proper. But Mr. Langer has just brought so much talent and time and dedication to everything he does, which I'm going to read about, but also to Constituting America. He's one of our fabulous, extraordinary guest essayists every year in our 90-day study. And let me read a little bit his official bio here. Andrew Langer is the president of the Institute of Liberty, a radio show host for WBAL Baltimore 1090, and most recently, in the fall of 2019, Andrew joined the faculty of the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, the nation's second oldest college, and is also his alma mater. He teaches on the regulatory state in the university's public policy program.
Yeah.
Welcome!
It's great to be here. You know, this is an organization that I have enthusiastically supported for a long time. I believe in its mission, and more to the point, I believe in it because of the folks who are participating. This is such vital information, especially as we educate students about the Constitution, especially at times like today, which is why we're doing this. Exactly.
And so we're thrilled that you're with us. And today we're going to talk about the pandemic and the Constitution. You know, if ever there were a time when people are learning about the Constitution and learning and trying to understand how it works, this is the time. So we're going to break this down into 3 segments with Mr. Langer here. One is going to be, what did our founding fathers envision? What does the Constitution say? We're going to keep this nonpartisan because Constituting America is nonpartisan. The Constitution's nonpartisan. And so we're going to talk about purely from a nonpartisan way. What did our founding fathers envision? What does the Constitution say about the structure of dealing with this sort of pandemic with which we're dealing? The second thing we're going to talk about is what's the report card? How is the government handling the health situation, federal, states, local, How is that playing out in accordance with the Constitution regarding our health, such as getting the masks and the ventilators and the responsibility of whose responsibility it is. And the third section is going to be about these trillion-dollar bills that are being passed to help everyone. How does that fit in to the United States Constitution? And I've already heard a little tidbit of what Mr. Langer has to say about that. It's going to be really fascinating. So Mr. Langer is going to speak. I'm going to ask questions. Then Tova and Dakare are going to ask questions. And then we're going to open it up for one of the students to ask questions and potentially an adult. Mr. Andrew Langer, let's talk about what our founding fathers envisioned. What does the Constitution say in a non-partisan way about a crisis such as this?
Well, it's interesting because, in my regular life, in terms of public policy and in terms of the work that I've done, I've long been guided by a 1992 Supreme Court decision written by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor called New York versus United States. And they're dealing with a particular issue, but Justice O'Connor said something really interesting, which is, and it's a quote that I have long memorized, a number of you have heard me use it before, which is that the Constitution protects us from our own best intentions. It divides power among sovereigns, so different levels of government, and among branches of government precisely, so that we might resist the temptation to concentrate power in one branch as the expedient solution to the crisis of the day. So the founders set up this system because they were inherently skeptical of concentrated, centralized governmental power, because they knew that that power could be abused. And what they wanted was a system in which the power, well, it flowed outwards from the people and it flowed through the states and into the federal government, but they knew that that government governed best, which is that which governed least, and that which was closest to the people. So they knew that most of the solutions to the various problems that were being faced, they would most likely start out in state or local governmental entities and maybe flow upward, and you'd have this federal government of limited powers. Now, that being said, they always recognize that in terms of this balance between people and the government, that the government exists to protect and preserve individual rights. Among those rights is to be safe and secure in your person and your possessions. And so government has some fairly extraordinary powers, government at all levels has some fairly extraordinary powers when it comes to protecting public health and safety. This is where we derive the concept of the police powers, in our system. So let's start here. Someone's born. They have the full measure of their individual rights intact when they are born. And I like to call this the single solitary man theory, right? So, or woman, person, single solitary person theory. And they can exercise the full measure of their rights until they come and meet up with another person. And when they meet up with that other person, their rights come into conflict with one another. And all of our laws are sort of born out of that intersection and that conflict. And so what happens is that we cede some measure of our rights, we give up some measure of our rights to government in the form of power, and then we have government use that power. And in terms of times of crisis, health emergency, national emergency, we recognize that those powers in government are going to be expanded, though that power is still limited in a whole host of different ways. Not just at the ballot box in elections, and not just in sort of court challenges and things of that nature, but the government can't simply go out and do whatever it wants. That there has to be some kind of a justification in mind. And obviously, depending on the severity of that crisis, depending on the situation, those things have changed. So now we're in a very extraordinary time period. We are in an unprecedented public health emergency. And so we've given government a fair amount of leeway in terms of dealing with it. They can't do everything, and every level of government can't do everything. But again, following in this structure of different sovereigns, different, state, local, federal levels, and different branches, each one has a different part to play in all of this, with a lot of power being devolved to the states and localities in terms of solving that problem. And certainly that's a lot of what the president's been doing. I know you want to get to that, but that sort of sets it up, I hope, Janine, for you.
Yeah, it does. And I remember this. I looked down for a second, which I know can be so distracting, because I'm looking for the quote that Vice President Pence said in one of his press conferences, because I watch all of them in complete detail. He said, I think this sums up that this response to this pandemic is locally executed, state managed, and federally supported.
Yeah.
Would you say that echoes what the Constitution says?
Well, no, and absolutely it does. And it really has to be, right? Because what is happening on the ground in James City County, Virginia, is not the same thing that is happening on the ground in White Plains, New York. It's not the same thing that's happening on the ground in Salina, Kansas, or Short Rock, Texas, or wherever. And so, you know, each locality is going to respond in a different way, and that's the way it has to be. You know, once you start getting down to this, and you know, we're going to get into the issues of things like the Defense Production Act and the problems that that can entail. Once you start getting an overarching federal bureaucracy dictating things, then you know you lose a great deal of the flexibility that in a crisis like this is essential. Let's remember this, Janine. That's the brilliance of the Constitution. The brilliance of the Constitution, it comes out of its light and airy and flexible structure. That the founders recognized that they wouldn't have all the answers, that their successors wouldn't have all the answers. And so we as a society would need to have flexibility in our solutions. And so this Constitution gives us enough structure so that the government functions and it protects individual rights, but at the same time, it allows for the people to retain all the power and the ability to manage their daily lives.
So, two things on my mind. If I'm thinking like people out there, what they're thinking. One is masks.
Yeah.
You know, you hear, and ventilators. You hear Trump say, you know, we're not a distribution center. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's also, Dusha should talk about the government and
Sure.
the businesses out there are coming together to work together like they did in World War II. And the government can't even produce all the masks and things it needs to. So it's the businesses that are coming in every day in those press conferences. President Trump brings out UPS or FedEx or, you know, Walmart, Walgreens. You know, he brings out all these companies that are producing things in mass quality. So my first question is about the responsibility, because then President Trump is saying, well, you know, these governors could have ordered all these ventilators on their own. They're supposed to have their own stockpile within the states. So whose responsibility is that, A? But B, the other thing, gosh, that was on my mind, and I may have to come back to what B was. Oh, a lot of people feel that where the epicenter is right now, say it's New York City, and then it's going to be Louisiana, that there should be a federal, what's the word? They can't leave. That the people should not be able to leave New York City.
Yeah.
A quarantine. Yeah, you cannot leave. And a lot of people feel that way. You know, they just should not be leaving. Why? And as the governor of Florida said, we shut down anybody coming in from China. We shut down anybody coming in from Italy. Why now is everyone dashing to plant seeds all around the country? So I'd like your thought about that, where the federal government, the Constitution says, so both about the responsibility of the mask and the ventilators, and then also a quarantine.
Well, then let's definitely start with the first part first, which is that it's always incumbent upon states and localities and private businesses themselves or private medical facilities to make sure that they have enough emergency provisions on hand. That, you know, yes, the federal government does a fair amount of this, and there's a lot of emergency stockpiling, but it's never been left entirely to the federal government to do these things. And this kind of gets into this issue of flexibility. And why it is so important to allow the private sector to do what the private sector does. I real quick, back in 2003, 2004, when I was lobbying for the National Federation of Independent Business, I was invited to a series of meetings with Homeland Security and the Health and Human Services Department as they were sort of putting together a playbook in case of a national pandemic. And one of the things that they talked about was shutting down businesses, and I talked about why that wasn't very good. But also what they had forgotten was that during 9/11, there was a huge outcropping of creative responses and creative assistance. And one of the examples that I like to use is a sporting goods store donated a truckload of tennis balls to the effort. And folks would sit there and say, well, what do tennis balls have to do with, a plane hitting the World Trade Towers? Well, someone realized that, you have all this twisted metal rebar that is in the debris. It's a hazard. You take one of these tennis balls and pop it on the end of it, and you've now marked where this hazard is. And it's the kind of thing that nobody would have thought about, in the bureaucracy of the federal government, but it's the creativity of the private sector and private responses to things where folks come up with these solutions. And that's absolutely essential, right? You can't have the federal government turning around and ordering Under Armour or Versace or whomever to start making masks or ventilators or what have you. Not only because it just doesn't quite work that way, but also because, and rightly so, once you introduce the federal bureaucracy into any kind of an enterprise, you all of a sudden get things gummed up in red tape. You can't turn and pivot and change your focus on a dime. You're now sort of committed to a particular course of action, which is not what you want to do. So, that's part of the reason why you leave this flexibility. And now you gave that.
But Mr. Langer, he did enact a law recently that he was trying to negotiate with GM. GM was giving him a hard time to produce the ventilator. So finally he initiated that act, whatever it's called. And that act, right. And so that the government is capable of doing that.
It is, but and that's, it gets down to what we've talked about, which is this balance between the light touch and the heavy touch, right? Anytime government starts interfering in individual rights, they want to have as light a touch as possible to accomplish the public policy goals that are involved. Again, as we talk about travel, and we're going to get to this next, this is this issue of travel bans and restrictions on people gathering together. The Constitution and Supreme Court case law has always been talking about, when you're interfering with individual rights, you have to do it in the manner that is the lightest touch to achieve the goals that you want it to do. So, I don't know about GM's internal bureaucratic structure, but it apparently it became very clear that GM could not, because it is so massive, it could not turn on its own without some kind of an order to do this. And so the president had to do it in that way. But again, you only want to do that as a last resort because of the longstanding impacts on that enterprise and all of the hoops that have to be jumped through. So, the federal government steps in somewhere, there's a massive amount of red tape that all of a sudden becomes involved. And listen.
And so whose responsibility is it to have the testing and because everyone is blaming the administration for the testing, which did get botched up. But I mean, is the testing the federal responsibility and the masks and the ventilators? I mean.
Well, okay, some of it, but remember, this cuts both ways, right? Because some of it is the federal government, could have just taken the tests from the World Health Organization, but, we have our own standards and red tape in America, and that, prevents us from doing this. And then our own red tape sort of prevented the deployment of our own sort of successful testing program. And keep in mind, up until this point, even the tests that the private sector is producing, and this has nothing to do with the federal decision, it has nothing to do with anything the administration could have done or not done. The tests that we have now take days, and they're only about 60 to 70% effective. So the point is, one of the things that we cannot take lightly and do not take lightly in society is the issue of restricting Americans' freedom of movement, right? Freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. These are all sort of vital. That's why they're in the First Amendment of the Constitution. And so not that the Bill of Rights, is in order of priority, but the First Amendment is the First Amendment. And so what happens is this gets into, right, the federal executive branch has control over our borders. So they are allowed to determine by constitutional separation of powers, by attributed powers, they're allowed to determine who comes into the country and the time and manner and place that they come to the country and how long they can stay. So they can determine those things. This issue of restricting movement between states is something else entirely. And certainly theoretically under the Commerce Clause, technically the federal government should have some say in that. But the federal government does not want to start getting into the business of restricting movement. That is the kind of thing that can have seriously seriously deleterious effects on Americans and their psyche and their trust in government. So they try not to do that. Now, the problem then comes in this conflict between state governors. And the federal government may have to wind up stepping in here and mediating if the governor of Rhode Island starts kicking people with New York license plates out of the state, or forcing people who come into the state, like the governor of Delaware is doing. If you come into Delaware with out-of-state plates, they're demanding that you quarantine in place for 14 days. I'm not sure how they can restrict you from turning around and leaving Delaware, say, after a week or after a day. And the federal government may have to step in there and say, no, you can't do this, or yes, you can. But again, in this environment where we divide sovereigns and divide branches of government, it's very clear that the federal government has control over the borders and for mediating disputes between states. But the federal government is not going to go about, closing the George Washington Bridge between New York and New Jersey. Not only would that be an extraordinary step, but technically that's all governed by an interstate agreement between New York and New Jersey that creates what's called the Port Authority.
Okay, I'm going to turn over to Dakare and Tova, but I will say this. I told Juliet, my daughter, from the very beginning, I thought we were going to have a worse outbreak than China.
Yeah.
And the reason we were going to have a worse outbreak than China is because China, and we don't want this in America, but China is under communist rule, and they can just shut down and say, you're quarantined, you have to stay in your house, you're arrested, or you're sent off to some kind of prison camp. You can't speak, you can't petition, you have no freedoms. But because they could do that, they really confined it. And I felt that because of, ironically, these liberties and freedoms we have, people running all over the place and planting all these seeds, that we were going to have pretty much an uncontrollable outbreak.
Yeah, and this is exactly it. I mean, this is the push-pull between, the freedoms in our society and what we're willing to give up, and the safety. And, not that, Benjamin Franklin said it. He said, those who, give up a little temporary liberty, those who give up their liberty in order to find a little temporary security deserve neither liberty nor security. And it's prophetic words. We go down this path in terms of national crisis. And this is part of what makes what Governor Northam and what Governor Hogan and what other governors have said, the governor of Kansas, whose name's now escaping me, it makes them such a bitter pill for Americans to swallow, right? We are people who believe in freedom, and we believe in the ability to go and do, the things that we want to do. But we also are compassionate people when we sort of get this. So, these are, listen, as I tell my students, what is really clear at times like these is that these are, incredibly tough decisions to make. And they're not made cavalierly. They're not made cavalierly by the president. They're not made cavalierly by the governors. And so it's, and they are folks who are operating in some instances under some might say an overabundance of caution, but others might say that they are taking the risks seriously. And so that's all a matter of philosophy.
Tova, since you were the National Youth Director, I'm going to let you have the first question for Mr. Langer.
All right. So first of all, thank you so much. This has been really
Always.
informative. Yeah. I was just wondering if you could speak a little more about how the government's rights are differentiated during times of crisis,
Sure.
and then how those additional responsibilities and allowances are built into the Constitution.
Sure. And let's start here let me start with a very simple precept. When we talk about this issue, we have to remember that government does not have rights. Government has powers. People have rights, and the government's powers are derived from measures of our rights that we have ceded to it. So we have to be really, really clear about that. Government holds power. So, to answer your question, so we allow that government is allowed to, in times of emergency, to sort of expand their police powers to deal with public health and safety and the general welfare. But in times of real sort of legitimate crisis. And so we recognize, this is why the governors can call in troops, not to act in sort of the case of law enforcement, but to sort of help in sort of deal with the crises, but to also to act in sort of a calming effect. We recognize that government has the power to cordon off certain areas and restrict access to them. in case there is some kind of, but the point is, Tova, that they have to demonstrate this, and there are going to be recriminations after the emergency is over, right? This is why we're setting deadlines here of when these crises are going to pass, because at some point in time there's going to be oversight of this in a free society. We always have that. That's why we have a government of divided powers. And so what happens is, so the government makes a decision: we're going to cordon off this area, or we're going to restrict travel. It's like you have a city, and the city develops into unrest. The mayor of that city has the power to, invoke a curfew or what have you. And generally, it's, part of the check on that power is that the legislative branch can say something, and invariably the judicial branch can get involved and also say something. So, for instance, as we talk about this, in a number of states, you've had governors declare that firearms and ammunition dealers, they are not essential businesses, and therefore they're not allowed to be open during these crises. Well, that's a decision. It is a decision that is technically within the governor's power to make, sort of make this determination, but it's also within the rights of those businesses to challenge that decision in court, to go before a judge. And I don't think anybody has ruled on this, but I think most of the governors have sort of taken another step and said, okay, well, maybe if we're in a situation in which our police are constrained, our resources are constrained, maybe understanding that the people want to defend themselves and protect themselves may not be such a bad thing. So we're going to make sure that the firearm store owners are going to be able to be open. So that's the way that it's sort of built into all of this. It's why you divide these powers up, and the three branches of government in any state are co-equal.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I like what you said about the fact that, what was there? Some information flying around. Oh, the government has power, but the people have the rights.
Yes.
That was really, really good.
As a real quick, as I, when I teach at the college level, that's, regardless of what class I'm teaching, it's the thing that I almost always say: if there's one thing you learn out of this class, it's that concept, because we really have to get into this mindset of where, the existence of rights and the importance of rights, and keeping in mind, right, that under the 9th Amendment of the Constitution, the Constitution doesn't grant us anything, right? The Constitution doesn't grant any rights. We know this. The 9th Amendment says the powers, the enumeration in this Constitution of certain rights is not meant to deny or disparage the existence of others. I've just paraphrased it. But what that means is simply because something is put into the first 10 amendments to the Constitution doesn't mean, or something isn't put into there, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And that's an important point. I'm sorry, Dakare, I took away your time.
Well, I think the Declaration declares those rights, and the Constitution upholds those rights.
Well, no, because remember what the Declaration says, right? Remember, as Jefferson wrote the Declaration, he said that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Among. Mm-hmm. So Jefferson knew that the measure of rights was infinite, but that that among them were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah. But they're declared there. I mean, we first stated it.
Oh yeah.
In the Declaration of Independence. And the Constitution, yeah. Okay. So Dakare, what is your question?
I actually have two, but they're kind of like one. So I'm here in Charleston, South Carolina, and through Constituting America, I've learned that I can talk to my representatives. Well, last night, Congressman Joe Cunningham had a call, a tele press conference, where you could talk to him and ask him questions. Well, many people are talking about how Mayor of Charleston, John Tecklenburg, doesn't have the power to do some of the things he's doing. Like, he's saying that, no one can leave their house after a certain time, and if they do, they'll be fined $1,200, and all these different things. So that's my first question. Is that, that's been a big thing. And along with that, people have talked about, I've seen in the newspapers and op-eds that technically the government can't say that, church services can't be held because we have freedom of religion. How do you feel about that?
Well, sure. I mean, listen, let's take the first part first, which is, in point of fact, that under the sort of the general police power and understanding of the police powers in times of emergency, governments can restrict, again, the time, manner, and place of movement, so long as they can demonstrate down the road that this was reasonable. Now, here's the thing to also remember. It may be found down the road that what the mayor did was unreasonable, but you're not going to get this proved until much, much further down the road. That, again, it's like back during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus. That was later found to be unconstitutional. But while it was going on, it had the force and effect of law. There was no sort of way to challenge that. Not that I want to sort of go back and revisit the internment camps during World War II. But again, President Roosevelt felt that there was a national security threat. So they put Japanese Americans into internment camps, later to be found to be unconstitutional and a violation of the power of the government. Now, once it's been declared, once something has been ruled to have been a violation, an elected official can't turn around and do that. So you're not going to see the mayor of Charleston turning around and suspending the writ of habeas corpus, or the governor of South Carolina, or the president suspending the writ of habeas corpus. And so we have to keep that in mind. So give you, it's interesting because I had a conversation with a high school and actually kindergarten friend of mine who was married to someone who was born outside of the United States. This person was traveling outside of the United States. This person was not a United States citizen. And she wanted to bring her husband home he was in Europe, and was very worried that he was going to get caught up. And she felt that it was an internment camp, but it's being described as a quarantine camp. And despite my greatest entreaties that this person would not be interred indefinitely in a quarantine camp once they came in, and then only if they were exhibiting some kind of symptoms, I could not dissuade this person, and their spouse is staying abroad. But there is a perception that a quarantine camp or a quarantine environment where someone is going to be quarantined for 14 days, that is somehow akin to an internment camp, and it's just not the case. So we need to stay away from that. And I'm sorry, Dakare, what was your second question? Oh, about churches.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So this gets into this idea of the various restrictions in the traditional exercising of rights in the modern era. Because I got into this with somebody who was concerned that the Maryland legislature was abrogating the rights of individuals when they blocked the public from coming into the Maryland state capitol. And I explained to this person that's not what the First Amendment means. You have the right to petition your government for the redress of grievances. That does not mean that the government can't prevent you from going into a building. Like if you go and visit Washington, D.C., if you want to go and complain to Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, about something, you can't just walk into the Department of Education. You have to show your ID. You have to make an appointment. You have to have an appointment. You can't just walk in. So they can restrict it in that way. You still have, without violating your right to petition, because there are any one of a number of ways you can go and do that. In terms of exercising your religion, right, you still have the ability to exercise. Now, even now, it's interesting, Dakare, because I'm going to say this. So you can go and you can have a Zoom-based worship. There are any one of a number of ways that you can congregate with your church. The problem runs into in religious practices that don't allow for this. So, for instance, and I don't have a real good answer to this, Orthodox Jews in New York or wherever else, they cannot use electrical devices on the Sabbath from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. And so theoretically they could worship in their own homes. Like, government is not outlawing, right? The First Amendment is violated when government outlaws a religious practice. Or religion, or that's sort of where it goes down. But we have to sort of wrap our heads around this idea. I don't know what Orthodox Jews in New York do about this. I don't know how they congregate. My assumption is that they will either keep they will keep their services down to as very few people as possible, while still fulfilling God's will, but also ensuring the public health. But that's a real challenge there. So no, government preventing people from going to their churches is not a violation of churchgoers' First Amendment rights.
Gotcha.
So in other words, they can't congregate in the church, but they can still worship how
Absolutely.
they please.
Yeah, because there are other avenues, and right. Remember, the law weighs down. So a court would look at this and they say, okay, we're in a public health crisis. This is the manner in which the government is trying to achieve its goal in the least restrictive manner possible. Now, unfortunately, because it is such a painful emergency, the least restrictive manner is still pretty darn restrictive, and so we have to keep that in mind.
Oh, go ahead, Dakare.
So another thing that I was going to ask was, so a lot of these people in this call were also saying that, and I see this too. I go in the grocery store to like pick up stuff for my grandmother, and I go get stuff for myself, and I can come in with my N95 mask on and gloves and push around the cart, but there's plenty of other people that have nothing on and are just walking around Walmart or Food Lion or Publix, Harris Teeter, getting their groceries.
I'm guilty of that, Dakare, and I apologize.
And my mom's a nurse, and she will tell me, she says that, it's really the mask and the glove carry more of the virus than anything else, because what if you touch something in the store that has the virus on it, and then you go and touch some meat that doesn't have the virus, and you're still, so how do we?
Okay, see, here's the reality, and this is a conversation. So understand, my mother is an epidemiologist. My father is an environmental scientist who spent most of his career examining risk and the incidences of risk. And, this is a lot of public policy today. And frankly, as you live your life, you're constantly assessing and mitigating risks. And it's all about making choices. And there are choices that you make, and there are always trade-offs in those choices. In my fall regulatory process class, we spend a lot of time talking about risk and comparative risk assessment is what it's called. And invariably, you miss the unintended consequences, and you forget that there are ancillary impacts. I'll give you a really good example of this. So many states have enacted single-use plastic bag bans and styrofoam container bans, whereas we know now that in these kinds of environment, it is the reusable containers, if they're not washed properly, that can continue to carry and propagate the virus. And so we made one trade-off here on the issue of climate and the issue of not pollution, but solid waste and other kinds of waste. But on the other hand, we are increasing risks elsewhere. And it's like the general trade-off with how you handle this crisis. And one of the fundamental public policy questions, is the cure worse than the disease? So the only way that we as a nation can handle national emergencies is by being one of the most prosperous nations on earth. But if we hobble our economy in order to deal with this crisis, do we not harm more people? And that's an academic question of which there are a myriad of answers. But that's the essence of public policy. Yes, Janine.
Hang on, we're still running out of time here. Yeah. Tova, do you want one more question? Mr. Dakare took 3.
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering, generally, do you know how this might impact elections? Yeah, because that's a big question. I know I was going to serve as an election judge in Illinois, and it was very dangerous to go, and like people might not turn out to vote in higher numbers, or they might not have physical voting locations. Have that work with security.
Let's start, Tova, with the constitutional question, which is, can the president cancel the election? No, the president cannot cancel the election. Now, on the other hand, state governors and state boards of elections can move things around. Very controversial in Virginia right now because we're in a primary cycle. New York has moved their primary, but Virginia pushed the date that everything is reopening till after when this primary was supposed to happen. So that's a whole big issue here. Lots and lots of questions. Are the major political parties going to have their conventions this summer? For Republicans, it's an easy thing, right? Because they have a nominee. Even with Bernie Sanders, even with Joe Biden being the leader, there's no guarantee that Joe Biden would get the nomination. So they have to have some kind of a convention. So if they don't do that, what happens? But that's again, that's not a constitutional issue. But in terms of the constitutional structure, it would be left to the states. And this is, again, as we're having debates about the Electoral College and we're having debates about how people can go about voting, ultimately those decisions are left to the state governments to decide. There are some states that are going to push for a some kind of mail-in election. Let me make this really clear. Let's make this clear. The president cannot. Congress could make decisions and change election law and pass something on this. They can move in that realm. But the president himself could not do this. And there are very good reasons for this. Again, the founders were distrustful of centralized power. You don't want to give the chief executive of the federal government the power to keep himself in power in perpetuity.
Yeah, I think that would be a very dangerous thing if the president were allowed to do that. I just thought there was some controversy about years ago that this could potentially happen. Okay, so now we have a guest, and we only have 7 more minutes. A guest. We didn't even get into the economic aspect. Ms. Gillespie wants a guest to ask a question, so let's work on that.
So I know the stock market has been at an all-time low recently due to the coronavirus. I wanted to ask, how do you think after this virus is over, will it be able to regain its profits and come back to what it was before the virus?
Well, listen, it's
How old are you?
How
old are you?
I'm 13 years old.
Well, thank you for your question.
Yeah. And Amy, let's remember that the stock market's very volatile right now. So while we had a major drop 2 weeks ago, right? Last week we had the single highest gain percentage-wise in the stock market since 1938. And what's really interesting about this crisis, as opposed to others, is that we are actually learning from the lessons of the past here. And we're learning about how to stabilize an economy. We're understanding a little bit better how all of the different parts of the economy work together, what the stock market signals and what it doesn't signal. And so it's a situation in which if we can proceed smartly and calmly throughout this, yeah, I mean, it's every indication that things are going to start roaring back. The problem, of course, is we've got to remember how this economy works. And that means sort of taking care of the small businesses that are out there.
Okay. I did have a question about the question about the president delaying the election. It's in the Constitution, correct? The election mandate. Wouldn't it take basically a constitutional amendment?
Well, if I'm reading the Constitution correctly, I got to pull it up. The Constitution doesn't say that the election has to be held on the first Tuesday in November. I think that it just says that the election has to be held. And then it gets in, of course, with the Electoral College. Now the Electoral College meets, right? Remember, this is a structure that is designed to be flexible in a whole host of ways. And the upside of that is you have apparatuses like the Electoral College, which is designed to protect the rights of individuals in smaller states, less populated states. But at the same time, it also allows states the flexibility in being able to determine how those electors are chosen. So, the Constitution says, we have to, senators are elected. Actually, we'll get into that in a second. The Constitution initially said that members of the House were elected every 2 years. Senators were chosen out of their state legislatures every 6 years or appointed out of their state legislatures. The 17th Amendment changed that to make them directly elected. The president's elected every 4 years. The president can only serve 2 terms. And then there are other things that are in there. But, again, right, if Congress turned around and said, okay, we need to delay the election by a month or whatever, someone would probably challenge this in court. It would be up to the Supreme Court to decide, and they would probably meet very quickly and sort of work this whole thing through.
Just going back to the elections, I was just wondering if you could foresee any issues with who is able to vote, like voter access as a result of the pandemic. For example, if we do go along with the elections, could there possibly be a lower voter turnout among the elderly, among those with disabilities, among those who are immunocompromised? And would that be violating the Constitution if there are barriers to voting for those demographics?
Well, listen, I think if there are restrictions still in place and we're in the middle of the crisis and we have a traditional election, Yeah, one might make that case, certainly. I think if we're at that point come November, then we will be moving towards mail-in ballots, which come with their own things. You know, it's interesting. I'm teaching, or I'm working with a center at William and Mary on the use of blockchain to solve public policy problems. Not that I want to go down this rabbit hole, but there's a real there's some real studies being done on the use of this secure ledgering technology called blockchain to make it easier for people to vote electronically. Not that we're there yet, and not that we would be there in November. If we're at that point, and I think we should all be praying that we're not, we would be moving towards a mail-in ballot. I think we may wind up seeing this with some of the late spring, early summer primaries that are happening, and that'll be sort of the initial test.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's move on to, yes, thank you both, all of you. So let's move on to phase 3 of this discussion, Mr. Langer, which is about the bills that have been passed. I know you have a lot of thoughts on that,
Cool.
and the Fifth Amendment, which is interesting. So yes, we've just passed these extraordinary bills of, you know, trillions of dollars. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, you know, and there's been some real discussion. The amount of time I spend on the radio, you always get folks who are trying to use this crisis for political snark. And I caution everybody on both sides. You know, if you're using this to try to score political points, don't. You're missing the seriousness of the crisis. You're missing the fact that it's a real crisis, and you're missing the fact that we all have to come together to solve this crisis. But, you know, on this issue, one of the things that's come up is, well, you have so-called free market limited government conservatives and libertarians who are all, you know, now they're big government socialists because they believe the government should be handing out cash. And the answer is no. This is not like, and I, you know, I've been talking to some of my colleagues about this, including my esteemed colleague, you know, Dan Mitchell, used to be at the Cato Institute, who's written some wonderful things about, you know, libertarian philosophy and small L government and small L libertarian governance and how it works in this crisis. Sorry.
Let's just stop there and explain to our students that if you're talking about the libertarian aspect, these are people who would not, I'm assuming this is what you're saying, the libertarians would not want the government to get involved with passing out money at all. But
Yes.
the socialists would say, yes, give all the money. So you're talking about 2 points of view here.
Yes.
I just want what you
And-
mean when you're saying,
but more to the point on the government's response. So the idea of the government sort of interceding in the individual lives of people and government's police power action. And so this is why I'm saying is that the writings of Dan Mitchell are very important because they talk about the government's police power. A lot of, you know, Dan Mitchell's somebody that I spend a lot of time reading on this stuff because he's a clear thinker about this. Dan Mitchell is a small L libertarian. And so he believes in limited government, but being someone who's in favor of limited government doesn't make one an anarchist, someone who believes in the absence of government. That government exists to preserve and protect individual rights, including the right to be secure in your persons, as we started off by talking about. Anyway, the point is this, that we have a tradition in America that when government action serves to take private property, or government rules and regulations serve to destroy or severely limit private property and private property rights, then the government has an obligation under the Fifth Amendment Constitution to make people whole, to compensate them for it. So the Fifth Amendment says, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And over the course of the last 240 years, all of those definitions have become muddied. But we now understand that public benefit, if there's some kind of public good being pursued, and that pursuit of the public good serves to destroy private property rights, like a business's existence, then under the concept of what's called a regulatory taking, which we now are almost at the 100th anniversary of that concept. That was enshrined in a 1922 decision called Pennsylvania Coal versus Mahan. You know, that what we're seeing with the bills that came out last week is an attempt to follow the Constitution's requirements of the government paying for the damage that it does.
and amendment. So just so I can clarify for the younger students, you're saying that that because people are sick and they're trying to withhold, other people getting sick and telling people what they're doing. I mean, that to not leave their homes, they are incurring some sort of economic damage, and that's why the government is doing what they're doing.
More to the point, when we're talking about businesses. So if you're telling people you can't open your business, if you're telling people, that the business is not essential and your employees can't do their work, if you are keeping people home so people can't patronize your business, then yeah, the government has enacted a regulation that is pursuing a kind of a public benefit. And under the concept of regulatory takings, government has an obligation in a just society to make that taking whole. And there's all sorts of discussion over the last 40 years, especially over temporary takings and to what degree does the regulation have to take away the business or the property in order for it to be compensated. But the point is, philosophically, this is where we are. That what underpins this, and it's not a stimulus, because we're not trying to stimulate the economy. These are recovery bills. These are bills that are trying to keep the economy afloat. This is not socialism, as in we're going to take wealth from one group of people, we're going to redistribute it and give it to other people because we're trying to pursue some other kind of a public goal. What we're trying to do is we're trying to make the people who've been harmed by the decision of this government whole. That's in the law, that's the concept of you in tort law, you are making the person who's been damaged, you make them whole once again.
Mm-hmm. Great. So that would be the individual person if they've lost their job too. So it's for the businesses, but also for the person that's having to stay home and is not able to work.
Yes, but keeping in mind, right, that we have a recognition that the two go hand in hand. That this is getting away from constitutional law and more into economics. But we know that in a working economy, small businesses provide, and these are businesses with between not zero employees, but between, let's say, 5 and 20 employees, or 3 and 20 employees, or 2 and 20 employees. Those are the ones who provide somewhere between 50% and 2/3 of all new jobs. And so in order for those folks to remain employed, we have to make sure that there is a job for them to come back to. And if government action has served to destroy the place where their job was, then the government has this obligation. I'll give you a really quick example, right? We have the Clean Water Act.
Totally fascinated through the Fifth Amendment. That's really cool to have learned that with you today.
Yeah, it's like this. We have wetlands regulations under the Clean Water Act. And if someone owns a 2,000 acre parcel of land, right, and 200 of those 2,000 acres are determined to be federally protected wetlands or waters of the United States that the person can't use, then the federal government has an obligation. And there's a whole bunch of Supreme Court cases that sort of outline that. The federal government has an obligation to compensate that person.
So let me ask you a question, Mr. Langer. What about, the fear so I think the general consensus of everyone, and this is certainly mine, is that what's happening right now with these bills are necessary, especially what you're saying. But there is the talk that, wow, this is going to be sort of the FDR movement through the world, that once you start these things during a depression or a war, so to speak, that it's hard to pull them back. That now everyone's going to expect $1,000 check every month. They're going to get used to that. So where's that, you think the American people are going to be able to go, wait a minute, this was just for a condensed cycle here?
Well, but Janine, this is why it's so important to make it really clear the constitutional obligations that are involved, right? And why this is different from the Great Depression of 1929 and beyond, and why it's different than the Great Recession of 2007 and beyond. Is that these are government actions that are having a direct impact. Someone made a declaration that we're going to do this, that the public health outweighs any other benefits that are out there, and so we're going to shut this stuff down. This is different than having a stock market crash in which sort of there were market failures upon market failures, and there were other things that were going on, and it may not have been the government's role to sort of do what it did back in the New Deal. And Amity Shlaes, who's a writer for the Wall Street Journal and other places, has written some excellent work on this. But by making this about the constitutional argument and government's obligation to live up to the damage that it can cause, however rightly it may have been, right? It may be completely and utterly justified, and it probably is, for the government to have engaged in the declaration of a massive public health emergency. Then the government then has an obligation to do what's right by dealing with the consequences.
I understand that, and I just hope the American people all understand that, and I think that's why we're doing this. You know what I mean? But there is that thought out there. Once you start opening that window, it's very hard to pull it back. Dakare, do you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. My question is regarding, so again, on that call last night, I'm hearing all of these questions. So, and he really didn't have an answer, which I don't blame him. He has COVID-19, so he's probably super sick. A woman was raising a question regarding small businesses.
Yeah.
And she was saying, and my aunt owns a pharmacy here in Charleston, small business. And this woman was saying that she owns a behavior clinic for teens and children, and that she has over 40 employees and that she had to lay all of them off because of this virus. And she says that, you know, what are these recovery bills, as you call them? What are these going to do for small businesses? How are these going to affect small businesses when she said, I think they're only giving people who, it's like a $10,000 limit. She said like her payroll is way over $10,000.
Well, no. Okay. So here's the thing. The SBA has a number of different programs that they're working on, and they're both grant programs and they're small business loan programs. And there will probably be, in the next phase when they come back, there will continue to be changes to this. So right now, for instance, small businesses can apply for loans that are 2.5 times their monthly payroll. The idea being that if this crisis lasts for 2.5 months, a small business can sort of float their payroll for most of their employees during that time. Remember, small businesses and working families go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And states themselves are also engaging in this. And sometimes these loans can turn into grants. So there are a whole series of programs that the SBA has available to it. I don't remember the names right now. So over the weekend, I talked to Brad Close of the National Federation of Independent Business, which is where I used to work, and Tom Sullivan at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who's their small business VP. And Tom's been a mentor and friend to me for a long time. And we're all sort of, what I would do, not that I want to turn people to other organizations, Janine and Cathy, but there are small business focused organizations like NFIB, like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that are offering up great pieces of information. I will send some of it to Constituting America for folks to put out there. But you may not think that the government cares about small business. And if you know, you talk to the folks Dakare, because again, as we've learned more about the way this economy works, we have a much better understanding now on all points on the political spectrum. We have a much better understanding of the vital role that small business plays in the economy and what we need to be doing for small business. And it's a situation in which small businesses were flying along up until this crisis. The highest levels of small business optimism, the highest levels of small business employment, a real understanding of the role and the interplay between regulations and small business. And, it's also, to get back to, I want to say, I think it was Amy's question early on, this is part of the reason why this economy may very well rebound faster, is because we have not just an understanding of the conditions by which an economy rockets along, but we've spent a good chunk of time putting those concepts into place. And so go and look at what the Chamber and NFIB are doing, look at what the SBA is doing, and you're going to find the resources that you need.
Why don't you tell everyone what SBA means?
Sorry, the SBA is the United States Small Business Administration. They elevated it they may have elevated it under the Obama administration to a cabinet level position. But we are now really taking small business priorities very seriously in this government.
Okay, so you're saying in regard to what Dakare said is that only getting $10,000 and that won't pay for everything. what was your direct answer to that?
My direct answer is there are a number of different programs out there, and I don't believe the limit is $10,000. I think the limit is 2.5 times your payroll. So if you can demonstrate that your payroll is whatever X, and then you can apply for and get a loan or a grant for 2.5 times that, because it's supposed to tide people over throughout this crisis.
I thought I heard you say that. I thought I heard you say that. Yeah. Okay, we only have about less than 15 minutes left. So we will ask, but I want to ask you really quickly before we go open it up. We're going to start opening up to a student and then adult, and then I think we'll wrap up here. You're in Maryland.
No, I'm in
Are y'all
Virginia.
one of the, you're in Virginia.
Yes, but I do.
Okay, so Mr. Linger, why June 10th? Where are they getting that?
Well, okay, so right there, from a public policy perspective, Janine, there are lots of different ways to look at this. And one of the ways to look at it is you say, okay, I'm going to set out incremental goals and we're going to revisit it down the road. And that way we're not overwhelming people by setting a date. The problem, the downside to that is when you have to extend, when you reach that decision, you say, okay, we're going to revisit it on March 30th. We're going to revisit it on April 8th. We're going to, it tends to drag along. On the other hand, you could say, okay, we're going to shut everything down until June 10th. And then that gives the governor the flexibility to, if May 15th comes around and we've solved this crisis, he can turn around and declare, okay, we can open everything up now a month or, almost a month earlier than I'd anticipated.
All right. Well, okay. I didn't know if there was some kind of medical issue that they knew about that we should know. Okay.
Hold on, Janine, time out for a second. I mean, let's be really clear about this. So right now what we're looking at, and this gets in, I think Dakare asked about this, and Tova may have asked as well. From a medical standpoint, from an epidemiological standpoint, and epidemiology is the study of the incidence of disease in people. That's why you see all of these epidemiologists who are out there giving their opinion. These are important opinions as they look at the data, they look at what's happening. We're at a critical time here. We're starting to see some of the numbers come down in certain areas. And if we relax, the idea is if we relax the standards too quickly and people get out there, then you can get this second wave, which we're hearing rumors that's been happening in China. I know, Janine, you were talking about China earlier. We can't trust the numbers out of China because they are a closed society. Part of the reason why we're in this crisis is because China is so closed off and they didn't let anybody know about it. It's essentially like the Soviets did in Chernobyl. But the setting it up for June 10th gives Governor Northam enough time to sort of watch this thing all the way through. Again, there are two different approaches. And this is the issue with public policy, is that there are any one of a number of different ways to approach a particular problem. And some of them can be more right than others. Some of them can be more wrong than others. Ultimately, a decision has to be made. That's what makes these issues so complex.
So in New York, so right now they have it really bad. In New York, what if they don't have means to work from home? Or anywhere for that matter.
Well, and Isabel, this is also a legitimate issue here. It's also the issue with students and school. Isabel, are you in New York?
No, I'm in Missouri.
Okay. So what happens is, right, there have to be allowances made in these kinds of situations. Now, I think it's terrible that with regards to school, like I know some school districts are providing electronic equipment or finding ways to do this. I've been talking with my listeners about this who don't have access. Like, Isabel, how about we go here? What if you're a person who wants to be able to apply for your recovery check? You're on Social Security disability and you don't have a computer. How do you apply for this thing? And so in an instance like that, there has to be allowances made, for people to call in or for people to be able to, anyway, there are allowances that have to be made. With jobs themselves, right? This is something that will have to be solved. There's no one answer. And I don't mean for this to sound like a cop-out. But what happens is that if you can't work from home, well, part of this is why you get a recovery check. Part of this is why we are giving businesses or finding ways to give businesses money so that they can continue to pay their employees while they're still at home. So there are any one of a number of ways. No solution is going to be perfect, but we have to remember in a crisis, we're all just trying to do the best that we can.
Mr. Langer.
Yeah, Dakare.
You're 2 minutes. You're a university professor, I know, and many of us are in school. I know that Appalachian State has moved to pass-fail.
Yes.
And a lot of other colleges have done the same. How do you feel about that?
Listen, for me, I've never been focused on grades particularly. If my college decides to go pass-fail, that's fine. But for me, I'm always more focused on making sure that my students are fluent in the subject matter than I am in grades. They're in my class to learn. I'm teaching the class to teach them what I know. These are all kinds of issues. There's the issue of grades. There's the issue of giving students rebates for the semester and the tuition. There's the issue of kids being allowed to leave their stuff in their dorm rooms because they can't get back. All kinds of questions. Here's what I come back to. This is going to be a cop-out answer. I'm telling you right now. This is a golden opportunity for students to learn about the importance of getting together and articulating coherent positions and advocating for themselves. I've told my students I'm happy to help them do that. And I don't mean this in an obnoxious way. I'm not trying to destroy the university, but the students have a voice, and we have to find ways to deal with this.
So, Mr. Langer, one of the things we teach is, in the speeches to students, it's about the tools in the toolbox that they have. They have these tools in the toolbox, and it starts with petitioning. Then you use your speech. Then you call the press. Then you plan your assembly. Then you call your representatives. So that would be a good way, right, Tova and Dakare?
Right. That's why Constituting America is so amazing. It it empowers us to do just what you were saying, Andrew, to be able to stand up for ourselves.
Absolutely.
I've been involved.
That's why I'm on those calls with congressmen from North Carolina and South Carolina asking questions and figuring stuff.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, Mr. Langer, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Time and your expertise. This was fascinating.
Anytime, guys. I'm happy to do this. Listen, we got a long crisis, and whatever I can do to help out, just let me know. I'm happy to sit here.
I'm gonna plug your radio show again, or you go ahead by the time I get to it. It's
WBAL.com. If you go visit the Andrew Langer Show, you'll find me. Langer. You Facebook.com/Andrew Langer Show. You'll find out information about it.
You have your own foundation, which is your Institute for Liberty.
Yep. Yes. Yeah. And I choose liberty.org.
Say that again. I talked over you.
Sorry. I choose liberty.org.
I choose liberty.org. And now you're at William and Mary as a professor. So they're lucky to have you.
I am blessed every day. As my wife says, I come home from teaching class, or I used to come home from teaching class. Now I walk across the room and I'm full of joy. It really is a dream come true.
And thank you so much for coming to be with us today. And I thank the team, and I thank Tova and Dakare and everybody listening. Thank you for a great session. Thank you, Cathy, Lisa, and Jeanette. So everyone have a great day. Stay safe and healthy.